Record now. And let's get started. If you can see my screen share, then hopefully you'll be able to see the slides change. Let me know if you can't. Just to introduce the session, what will be covered. Session introduction is roughly 5 minutes. I mean, these are probably exaggerated slightly. Neurodivergent and neurotypical, kind of an overview of that around communications is another 5 minutes. Scenarios, we'll be digging into how this presents in workplace settings, case studies, that will be about 10 minutes, and then Q&A, which if we stay the number that we are, won't be very long. So the whole session will probably be no longer than 30 minutes, which is a good amount of time to dip in and dip out of a conversation like this. And it's all about generating a discussion. If you have any questions, just feel free to stop me as I'm going. It's not a monologue. It's supposed to be a conversation. I'm really here to help support anyone who needs additional information around communicating with neurodivergent employees. And I don't say rules, but I say the premise of the session is for it to be neuro-inclusive, which means it's entirely up to you whether you have your cameras off or on. It's your choice. And if you don't want to have your cameras on or you don't want to speak, feel free, and you can use your chat function instead if you don't want to use your mic. But of course, you're free to use your mic, so feel free. And I think it's important to say that because often when you have sessions like this, webinars, there's this expectation that cameras have to be on, everybody has to be vocal, everyone must participate in a similar way, but that's not very neuro-inclusive. So I may as well practice what I preach. So that's why I thought it would be important to say this as a kickoff. And just to kick off with the business case for neuro-inclusion, I'm sure I'm preaching to the converted with you, Cassandra, at least. But for other participants and those watching on playback, they may not be aware that, a good number of people are neurodivergent, 15 to 20% of the population, so 1 in 5. And most of those people are a mixture of neurotypes. So you won't necessarily just have autistic people or people with ADHD or people with dyspraxia or people with Tourette's, OCD. You'll have co-diagnosis, parallel diagnosis. So a lot of neurodivergent people have double diagnoses. Autistic people are often ADHDers and vice versa. So that's why there's such a large number of people who are neurodivergent, and it's not as simple as you may think. It's not just one neurotype. And you may know already that neurodiverse teams increase innovation and drive better business performance the more diverse your teams are, particularly around neurodivergence. The more business performance you get, the higher performance you get, because you've got that mix of thinking and ways of working through problems to deliver solutions. And employee engagement and retention improve too with neurodiversity. And of course, recruitment costs decrease because you've got lower turnover when you've got people who are supported in an organization when they are neurodivergent, and that often doesn't happen. So the case is, if they are not supported, then usually they will leave. So this is where we get into the nitty gritty of it, the 5 different communication approaches overall. And these are very generic, but they are usually quite applicable in most cases when you're talking about neurodivergent people versus non-neurodivergent. And I use neurotypical because it's a term that a lot of people understand. But all we mean by neurotypical is not neurodivergent. We don't mean not neurodiverse. So us 3 on the call, there are different ways of thinking, between us, different ways of processing information. And you may describe yourself as not neurodivergent or neurotypical, but in fact, we're all neurodiverse. But when we say neurodivergent, we are specifically talking about those conditions or neurotypes like autism, ADHD, etc. And I can't see if anyone is trying to get in, so please, I don't know if you're able to see if anyone's trying to get in yourself. Just let me know if that's that's happening, because I can't necessarily see whether someone needs to be admitted into the room. Let me know if you see someone waiting. So neurodivergent priorities around communication, versus, and it's not necessarily versus, it's just compared to, I suppose. We don't want to pitch it, as a fight or as a competition, because it isn't. It's just differences. So neurodivergent priorities are around unimportant details blurring the lines. Often neurotypical people or non-neurodivergent people will want very specific ways of doing things, very specific things to be done in order to achieve a certain outcome. They are very prescriptive in the way that work needs to be carried out, for example, or the way that a task is done and the way that they communicate about that task or that project. But for neurodivergent people, that can be very confusing. It can blur the lines and it can stop them from actually knowing what they need to do and when. So being straightforward is helpful, and that feeds into it. Being very literal is important for neurodivergent people. Often autistic people are described as literal, and that's because they are. And when you think about it, I've spent quite a few years now since my children were diagnosed with neurodivergence, just thinking about the whole piece around complexity and unnecessary complexity. And it's something that, often happens. And I don't know, I know, Cassandra, you know me, but Claire, I haven't introduced myself to you, so apologies for that. My name's Kate Asiche, and I'm a neuro-inclusion consultant. I support managers and organizations to understand neurodivergence and to harness the skills of their neurodivergent employees, because they'll already be there. Often, organizations perceive neurodivergence as something over there, something outside of the organization, but in fact, it is there. It's present, and people need to recognize that. Not necessarily disclosed, not necessarily known even to the individual, but certainly there. For so many autistic people, small talk is unnecessary, but for people who are not neurodivergent, filling in silence makes them feel comfortable. It's small talk, how's the weather, or what did you do at the weekend? How was your evening? These are things that are often quite pivotal to the communication styles of non-neurodivergent people, because it gives them an inroad to have a conversation or to start a discussion, whereas neurodivergent people don't necessarily appreciate it and they don't enjoy it, more importantly. So it makes them feel strange, because they're thinking, well, why are we talking about the weather? I don't want to talk about the weather. And often, neurotypical people won't want to talk about the weather either. But they feel compelled to, because it's the only way they know how to create those conversations. So sugarcoating alongside of that, the whole piece around preamble, they're very similar. The last 3 points are not important. They cause issues, or they're not, understandable for neurodivergent people. But for neurotypical or non-neurodivergent people, these concepts of speaking about things which perhaps could be considered to be irrelevant are important. Context, providing flowery descriptions around stories or narratives or pieces of work is really important for people who are thinking in a specific way. But for neurodivergent people, it can be really confusing. It can blur the lines, and it can cause them to wonder about the reality of what they're doing, and the core piece that you want to achieve. So I've had instances where I'm also neurodivergent, with ADHD, not diagnosed, but self-diagnosed. And often, I would have had conversations with managers in the past, 20 years experience of working in corporate communications. So I've worked with a variety of stakeholders, from HR to marketing to recruitment. And for them, often they will provide additional information, surplus to what's required to understand the task or the project. And I've often thought to myself, I'm thinking about your additional pieces that you're adding in, but it's not actually important for me to know those things or to hear those things. But I know it's important for you to communicate in that way. And so often we have to pick out, the key pieces that are needed for us to actually execute the task well. So the key to communication, in my perspective, is flexibility. It's often the case that where you see communication challenges, it's to do with the fact that people aren't necessarily wanting to be flexible. They're wanting to do things in a very prescriptive way. And often autistic people are considered to be rigid, unchangeable or difficult to change. But I come to the conclusion that it's neurotypical people who are quite rigid, quite specific, because they want neurodivergent people to communicate in a very specific way, to conduct themselves in a very specific way. But that isn't natural to them or comfortable for them. So flexibility is really key, that ability to say, well, it may not be important to me, but it's important to them. And it works both ways, but neurotypical people are in the minority. So it's upon those who are in the majority to do the flexing. And it looks so simplistic when you look at it. If someone says they don't understand, help them to understand. If someone says they can't make sense of what you said, help them to make sense of it, repeat it. I've come across so many managers who just don't want to do that, who refuse to do that, and don't feel comfortable doing that. And it's such a simple thing, send another email or have a conversation or just explain it in a different way. Very simple and very effective, but you'd be surprised at the number of people who just feel they don't want to do it or don't feel it's necessary and blame the individual who doesn't understand for not being capable of understanding the very specific way that they're communicating. So it's interesting. And feel free to interrupt me as I go along if anything sparks in your mind. If you look at this scenario in front of you, it's a comic strip that I posted quite often on LinkedIn for a while. And it just gave me an opportunity to describe some of the experiences I've had without writing. Text can be quite inflammatory and cause some bad reactions, but if you put something in pictorial format like this, it gets people to think about things without necessarily knee-jerk reaction to what you're saying. So if you look at this scenario, Sarah, who's the young Black woman, she's the autistic and ADHD, which is described as ADHD. She is asking a very simple question about the meeting invite. Where is the meeting now? They've changed it. And her manager's saying, it's in the meeting invite. I sent you the meeting invite looking there. Sarah's explaining that she can't see it. She's not able to identify where this meeting room is. And all she has to do is literally say the meeting's in meeting room B or meeting room A, and the problem will be solved. This has happened to me on a number of occasions. And so when you look at this scenario, who's been rigid? Who's been inflexible? These are two individuals who are fictional characters that I created to demonstrate another scenario. Jing Zhang and his manager Sophie. Jing Zhang is autistic. He hasn't disclosed his diagnosis because he's fearful of the negative reactions which many people experience in workplaces across the world, not just in the UK. But he has been open about the accommodations that help him. So often neurodivergent people will explain that they are not able to work in a specific way, that they prefer to work in this way. They're able to do better work if they're allowed to work in a different way. And he's done this because he needs to stay safe in the kind of environment he's in, which is working on construction sites. Sophie finds it hard to communicate with her team member Ding Zhang. And the way Ding Zhang consumes and makes sense of information is different to most people, to neurotypical people or non-neurodivergent people. And this makes it really hard for Ding Zhang to perform his job at the high level that he's capable of. And that's the key thing. Often when people are not allowed to work in a way that helps them, they don't perform in the way that their manager wants them to, and they're deemed as poor performers, or problematic or difficult in some way. But Dingjang also struggles to connect with Sophie, and that's because she doesn't understand what makes him tick. And this is something that a lot of managers have problems with. They automatically jump to punitive action, let's put them on some kind of PIP, and let's correct them. But actually, what needs correcting is the communication approach and management approach. So how can Sophie adapt her communication style to Zhang in the working environment that he's in, specifically on construction sites where safety is paramount? Sophie's ambiguous. So many managers use nuance when they communicate, but this causes many neurodivergent people to be uncertain about what needs to be done. Does she mean that? Did he mean that? It's totally unnecessary. Just be straightforward in your communication. She's indecisive, and this causes frustration for her direct reports. She's not sure of things. Often she'll say, "Oh, maybe not." And I've experienced this myself in many working environments where managers have been extremely ambiguous. I'm just admitting someone to the room, who's joined. Hi, Devon. Hi, Devon. Can you hear?
I can indeed.
Hi, Devon. How you doing?
I'm doing good. How about you?
Yeah, not too bad, thank you. You're joined by two other participants, Claire and Cassandra. So welcome. Just a bit of a way into the presentation, but you can catch up on the recording because it's being recorded. So I'll carry on. I was just talking about a scenario that I created with two characters called Sophie and Jingjiang. Sophie's the manager and Jingjiang is the a direct report. And Sophie's rigid as well. She's very specific, very prescriptive. You must do things in this way, Jingjiang. You must do the project or the task in the way that I want you to do it. And I don't really, have any empathy or sympathy for the fact that you don't necessarily find that comfortable. This is the way that I want you to do it, so do it. And that rigidity, causes Xinjiang, some confusion and probably, some level of unhappiness too. She's reliant on complexity. Often managers will feel the need to be complex. I have to, arrange my work in such a way as that it looks complex, more complicated than it needs to be. I communicate in ways that are difficult to access and to understand and to, consume and process. But that just leaves many neurodivergent people feeling overwhelmed, if not neurotypical people too. And I think it's important to point out that a lot of these changes that I'm talking about will help a lot of people, most people. But what I don't like necessarily is when everyone says that all the time, oh, this will help everyone. Because yes, of course it will help everyone, but at the same time, neurodivergent people benefit more. And for them, it's a complete game changer. Whereas a neurotypical person can deal with ambiguity much easier, can deal with that indecisiveness, can deal with rigidity. They can adjust themselves, the way that they think, in order to adapt to that. But for neurodivergent people, it's just not something that's easy for them to do. And so therefore, the change is much more impactful for the neurodivergent population. And this vocal tone and pitch that so many people, neurodivergent people don't understand, but neurotypical people depend on. They say things in a certain way and relay into that some level of understanding. They think that by presenting a specific communication with a specific tone and pitch, that it will adapt the meaning for you. And this simply isn't the case for many people, and certainly for neurodivergent people. So if I say to you, I'm going to cancel it, And then I say to you, I'm going to cancel it. Many neurotypical people may be able to see the slight difference between those two, the way that I presented it, my facial expression, my tone of voice, the pitch at which I said it, may may interpret that communication in a specific way for you as a neurotypical person. For a neurodivergent person, and this has happened to me on a number of occasions, it means I'm going to cancel it. And that's it. So when you communicate in this way, what are you missing out on? It's high performance, but not in a neurotypical way. So often in organizations, you'll hear this term A game. Everyone needs to be on their A game. But the A game, we know, is defined and prescribed by the majority of people who are neurotypical, who are not neurodivergent. And so therefore, when they're thinking about this high performance, this A game, they're thinking about it in a very neurotypical way. But if you're able to communicate and you're able to adapt and be more flexible in a way that neurodivergent people can access, then you will get access to creativity, innovation, hyperfocus, attention to detail, identifying patterns, and the ability to think differently. We call it design thinking in some spaces, but with all of the adjustments that you see on the right-hand side, being flexible, allowing autonomy, being flexible enough to give adjustments, supporting your team members and facilitating their ability to be able to have the space and time to design, think, for example. And that is the end of the question, the end of the presentation. So it's time for you to ask your questions. Yeah, anything that came to mind. I told you it would be a short session.
How do you manage it if there are one that's autistic, one that's ADHD, and everybody in the team wants different communication styles in the real world, as in, managing your own timescales and ability? How does that pan out?
Yeah, it's not easy. You can't please everyone for sure. But the main thing to consider is the flexibility. And this is why I said that right at the very beginning. If you're flexible, you can adapt. If you have that mindset, which is, typical growth mindset, if you're rigid and inflexible, you're not going to help anyone, including yourself. But if you have a flexible mindset, you might sort of consider to yourself, the reason why this person isn't necessarily doing their job well could be because I'm not communicating with them in the right way. And so therefore, what you would do with that flexible way of thinking is just slightly adapt, or maybe go to the trouble of repeating information, or doing something in a different way that helps them to access it and also helps other people too, and maybe even help yourself. So it's that self-awareness that's more important than I'm not saying you communicate with this person in this way, you communicate with this person in another way. It's just about having that adaptability and flexibility that's key to reaching people. Yeah. And I'm learning that myself every day. It's not as if I'm an expert and I have all the answers.
Yeah.
I try to just use my experience to help others, because I know the massive difference it makes when you communicate effectively. It's like night and day, for a team, for an organization, for a department. It's amazing. And I think you've all heard the saying that the biggest myth about communication is that it's taken place. I sent the email, therefore, I've communicated it. And we all know that's just not the reality.
But I think you said something earlier on. Is there a responsibility of both parties to, if you've done reasonable adjustments, or you consider it, or come up with suggestions and the person never implements them or never interacts with it? Would you say there should be a responsibility on them as well to engage with it?
100%. It's a shared responsibility. Yeah, you cannot expect
It's serious.
everybody on one side. You've got to be both parties have got to be willing. And this is why I said it's not a versus situation. It's not them and us. I try not to pitch it in that way because often the media does that. They'll sort of, make it into this inflammatory thing where, a neurodivergent person, did this and their manager did that. And it was, this person was right and this person was wrong. And I'm not talking about those instances where it's clear that, an individual has been discriminated against. But if someone is trying to accommodate your needs, then yes, of course, it's got to be give and take. Everyone's got to be flexible, but it's worth remembering that for an autistic person in particular, flexibility is quite difficult in their situation because they don't have it's not as easy for them to be able to change and adapt quickly as it is for a neurotypical person. There are certain parts of our brain, neurotypical brains, not my brain because I'm not neurotypical, but neurotypical brains that are able to adapt and process and behave in ways that make it easier to exist in the world that we live in. Whereas many neurodivergent people don't have that brain pattern, theirs is very different. And it's just not something that, they choose not to do. It's like, I don't fancy doing that today. They physically can't do it. And I think that's worth remembering.
Would you say it's their responsibility or a manager's responsibility to come up with the ideas of adjustments or a joint thing, really?
That's a good question. Yeah, I get asked this quite a lot, and I think it's a joint responsibility because often I used to think it was the onus was on the neurodivergent person. A few years ago, I used to think that, but then I spoke to quite a number of neurodivergent people who said, I actually would appreciate some support with identifying the accommodations that will help me because they know what their challenges are, they know what they need in order to do good work. They know they've got skills, but they don't necessarily know how that translates into the working environment. So yeah, it's got to be a co-creation job, but the better your culture is around neuro-inclusivity, the more that will happen. If you're kind of doing it as an add-on, it's going to be, at the side of your table, I might take a look at that if I've got time, then it becomes, more difficult. This is why I always talk about curating a culture which is neuro-inclusive. And it's not easy, I'm not saying it is, but once you have that firm foundation of flexibility, adaptability, growth mindset, and understanding, then it makes it so much easier because you're not blaming people, you're not pointing fingers.
Thank you.
I have a real quick question. Want to do it?
Hi, Devon.
Hey, so I am definitely not camera ready. So I'm going to stay
Yeah,
on.
no worries. I said that you missed at the beginning. I actually said that this is a neuro-inclusive session. So cameras on or off, it's your choice.
Oh, perfect. I have a project lead who is on the spectrum. He is great, super process driven, and it's a tough situation because the KPIs that the project has set in track are really high. The downside is that he's lost focus of the end result and the end, making sure the end client for the product is essentially buying more and like actually continuing with revenue. So it's very much of a situation of like he can't see the forest from the trees of a situation. And I'm having a hard time communicating this to him because his default reaction is, well, the KPIs that we've set in place are great, but I know in like 2-3 months that when we finish the project, when he finishes the project, he's going to miss the mark. How are different ways I can communicate this because I'm failing at communicating this.
Does the KPI, are the KPIs alluding to what you're just describing? Do they make it clear what the overall targets are and what success would look like? Are they articulating that clearly, do you think?
I I think the KPIs are okay. I mean, they're more off of build metrics and expansion metrics. The downside is that the end zone has changed to make the KPIs like he's essentially changed like where the finish line is, so the KPIs by default look really good.
But the goalposts have changed, is that what you're saying?
Correct. I think this might be a different different terminology, but yes, the goalpost has changed.
Yeah, we tend to use football terminology quite a lot in the UK. Yeah, that's a difficult one. I think you just have to be very literal about it and actually tell people what they need to hear. And many autistic people appreciate that. Neurotypical people are really afraid of saying things in black and white because they feel the need, and it's cultural, of course. In the UK, I think we are quite polite around communication. We dance around difficult conversations, perhaps not so much in America. And in places like Asia, they don't say no. Everything's yes, 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 yes. I've worked for many Asian companies. It's always yes, but that the answer isn't yes, it's no. But they just don't want to say it to you because they consider it impolite. But many neurodivergent people benefit from literal communication. I'm not talking about harsh communication. I'm not talking about rudeness or abruptness. Of course, with the respect, but literal communication is really key. Unless, of course, you've got ADHD in the mix, because that's something to bear in mind. ADHD is like myself. We do suffer from rejection sensitivity. It's not easy for an ADHDer to be told something which is perhaps a criticism of their performance, or a reminder to do something in a specific way. So yeah, I would just bite the bullet and be very open and honest and transparent, because it's that way you're going to save yourself a lot of trouble, and they probably appreciate it.
Do you do do you have a specific form of communication that worked best? Because I was on the phone with him on Monday,
Hmm.
and I felt like I was direct over a video call, but
Oh yeah.
I could tell it was not translating.
Did
Um,
you have your camera on?
I had my camera on. We both had our cameras on.
You both had your cameras on. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. Okay. And it was just verbally done.
correct.
Yeah. I think sometimes you have to say things twice, if not more, in different ways. So it's not necessarily about, I was just talking about, the myth that communication has taken place when actually it hasn't. I suffer from this too. So I'm like, I sent an email. Um, but, some people just don't understand communication by email. They're not able to make sense of the words. There could be some dyslexia there. Um, and if you're saying it verbally and you're on the camera, he may well have been focused on your face and on the visuals and on his own face, because often neurodivergent people are distracted by their image, hence the reason why they prefer to have their cameras off. I would just have another conversation with him in person, reiterate it perhaps in written format, just try different approaches, because often it takes a while to hit the mark, and everyone, consumes information in different ways. And it doesn't necessarily work for them. If you speak to them, writing, maybe something which adds an additional layer of communication, what you're doing is you're building blocks. And the more blocks you use, the more chance you have of being heard and understood, is what works in my
Gotcha.
experience.
Okay, this makes sense. This makes sense. So a little bit of trial and error, to be honest with you, and just trying to figure out, well, trying different forms of communication, and eventually one of them will stick.
Yeah. Yeah, I would try different forms and I would, have a very transparent and open and honest conversation. Often people feel like they're missing the mark somehow, that someone isn't necessarily getting what they're trying to say, and you can go into your own head then, you can become very introverted in your thinking as a manager and sort of start scratching your head and thinking, oh, you start assuming things about the individual, and that's usually wrong. Usually it's incorrect assumptions that you're making, just because you feel that communication is too hard. And when you feel like that, the best thing to do is try another way. It's what's always worked for me. I'm not saying it's easy, but it is simple. Literally just keep trying different ways to communicate and be very literal. Avoid all of the faff, the preamble, the context, talk about strategy, just lay it on the line, we need to achieve this by this date. Can we do it?
Actually, sounds good. Thank you.
Yeah, and you're welcome. You're very welcome. I hope this has been helpful for you all. If anything else does spring to mind, or if something that I've said might resonate with you later on. I'm like that. I'm a reflector. So I don't necessarily process things rather in the moment. I will do that later on, a few hours after the event. And then I'll think, oh, I had a question. You can always email me. You can always contact me on LinkedIn. And one more thing that I had to share with you is my contact details, which are on the screen now. I have a Calendly link if you want to book a quick 20-minute call to have another conversation with me, ask me more questions. I'm always willing and happy to do so. I've got my coaching link on the second line, and my email. So, and there's some QR codes which basically go through to the same pages. If you have anything that you feel you haven't touched on, or that you might sort of think, oh, well, she said that, but I'm not sure. Contact me afterwards. I'm more than happy to follow up.
Thank you very much. I have to leave
Thank
for
you.
the next one, but thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, everyone. Really good to see you. Thank you.
now.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. See you tomorrow evening.
Yeah, see you tomorrow, Cassandra.